It is on the West Coast. It's Tuesday morning. We're going to go and have our next in our series of OpenTelemetry live webinars. And I'm super excited to have our guest, Nityananda, from our SigNoz team to talk about, oh, I got a little banner for it. OpenTelemetry webinars, logs, and OpenTelemetry. Go ahead, Nitya, go ahead and introduce yourself to the people. Tell them what you do for the SigNoz team.
Hey everyone, my name is Nityananda. I am from Bangalore, India. So I work on the logs part, and I started working on it from scratch for the last 1.5 years, and then it's been a great journey here. Yeah, so a lot of new things to learn, and yeah, OpenTelemetry is getting developed day by day, and a lot of new things to learn and explore. So yeah, excited to be here with Nika. Yeah.
Okay, I love that so much. I really appreciate having you. I think um, one of the things that I think we can all agree on is that there has been logs have been this thing that are happening, but we don't always have like full coverage of how they work in OpenTelemetry. And I know a lot of us, I didn't load up the graphic, but a lot of us have experienced. One sec while I actually mute, because of course I have to play the stream in another tab to see the chat and stuff. So I have to mute it so we don't have it playing. But a lot of us have seen like the chart from the OpenTelemetry like framework support, and logs in all the frameworks is listed as like provisional, I think, except for the Java case. And so it's like, oh, so OpenTelemetry doesn't do logs yet or something, right? Like, oh, maybe it'll be next year we'll start doing logs in OpenTelemetry, and that's way off. So yeah, so I wanted to have you on, hopefully talk about that, hopefully encourage some people to dive into logging a little bit with OpenTelemetry and not use like a separate tool for that.
Right.
So I wrote some questions, but do feel free if you have questions in chat here. Go ahead and drop them into the chat. We will see them and try to answer them right away. So we do appreciate that. We've had some great chat participation on some of our past webinars. Thank you so much. But let's go ahead and dive in. Are you feeling ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
All right. So let's start with that basic one. How can logs be ingested into OpenTelemetry from existing logging libraries? So I guess wait, I'll just say my background to this question, which is when most people ask me about logging in OpenTelemetry, I say, look, it is true that, for example, the JavaScript SDK doesn't have beta releases for here's how to go ahead and send logs directly from your JavaScript code. But here's the thing, you're already sending logs to your JavaScript code with some existing logging library. So what you want to do is connect the two. So can we talk a little bit about how that works? Like, how can you ingest OpenTelemetry, logging into OpenTelemetry from existing logging libraries?
Right, right. So if you see, there are not a lot of SDKs that are available right now. So there is only Java and Python that is available right now. But the best thing right now is basically in every kind of application, you have something like you always print your logs to your console, and
Mm-hmm.
that happens in your deployed applications in your Kubernetes or Docker. So let's say if you have a Kubernetes cluster where all your applications are running, and then they're printing their logs to console. Now that's the easiest way to collect logs. Now what you can do is you can deploy the OpenTelemetry agent on your Kubernetes cluster, and it will automatically collect all of your application logs. So that's the easiest thing. So you don't need to do any kind of thing. You just need to install the agent on your Kubernetes cluster or even on your Docker. So if you install it on your Docker, all your Docker container logs will be collected and it will be sent to SigNoz. Now, once you get those logs, the next thing you have to do is basically you have to remap those attributes. So basically, let's say some of your applications are printing logs in JSON format, and some of them are printing in some other format. And then if you have something like the trace ID and span ID in your logs, that's great because you will be able to correlate them to your traces. Now, what you need to do is basically parse them. So yeah, once you parse them, then they are organized in the OpenTelemetry log model, and then you will be able to use it as normal. So that's the easiest and the best way to go, and that is supported by every kind of application because with all kinds of languages, you can just print your logs to console.
Yeah. So in general, right, we see that and the model of like go and tail a file,
Right.
and that's the default path, right, to get your logs in, is using the collector and using it to grab that data, right? You can do that
Right.
right from Docker containers, right from your Kubernetes cluster should be very easy. And part of the advantage there, right, is that like pod logs are like a concept already, right? So we should be able to grab those. That shouldn't be a problem for the collector.
Right, right. And there are lots of receivers as well. So here we just discussed about the file receiver. So you are something to a file, but there are certainly some other receivers, like let's say you have already something like Fluentd or Fluentbit in your cluster, and you just want to forward those logs to SigNoz. Those kind of receivers are also created by OpenTelemetry. So you can just enable them and then push your logs to OpenTelemetry.
And this kind of gets us into it. I didn't have this written down as a question, but like, one of the things that we would like to get across as we sort of try to give people like a professional view of OpenTelemetry is that you probably do not, you're going to need to deploy a collector, right? Like a collector is going to need to happen somewhere. And it is possible. I just finished a tutorial for like first time JavaScript developers wanting to send OpenTelemetry data. And it's like, oh yeah, go ahead and send like requests right from your code to send that data, but you're like hard coding in like URLs into your JavaScript code like that. That's not right. Like that can't be like where you're supposed to end up. So yeah, you're gonna need to deploy a collector. It is table stakes to get like actual full observability on your system, and that's not the goal of the project. The project definitely supports like SigNoz or whatever can be your collector someplace else on the internet and receive, but you're going to need at least some kind of collector somewhere for most applications. It's going to make sense.
Right. And OpenTelemetry has a lot of receivers. Like if you want to send your system logs, syslogs, or any kind of logs, you can just send them to OpenTelemetry.
Yeah, this is part of this thing is people ask me like, well, what is the collector? And I kind of give these vague answers because like, hey, it's just kind of a middleman, right? Like, because with the receivers and exporters that it has, right, it can be talking to another collector, which is further down the line. It can be sending things directly into a DB. It can be doing so many different possible like functions. It can be gathering syslogs and stuff. It can be gathering like system health info, right? So yeah, like there's a ton of receivers out there.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's we're totally not going to get through all of our questions if I don't go fast on that. So well, that's fine. These are good ones. So how do logs correlate with traces and metrics in OpenTelemetry's data model?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. So basically, ideally, what a user will expect is, let's say there is some issue with their application, they will go to a trace, and then they will want to see like with this trace what are the related logs. So in that case, you will want to know the logs for that trace, right? So in that case, the trace ID and span ID of OpenTelemetry is something which you can use to correlate. Now that correlation can be done only from traces to logs or logs to traces. So let's say you have a trace and you want to see the logs, then you can go from a trace to a log. And then let's say you have some log lines, and then you want to see what is the corresponding trace for this log line. So in that case, you can go from logs to trace. But in metrics, you can't, there's no like something like a trace ID or span ID. But what you can do is basically at max, you can use the resource attributes, like which host did it came from, what is the application name, and for the time range, you can check the metrics for that application.
Yeah.
So
and it's funny, I wrote this question to talk a little bit about how like there's a little bit of incompletion here, and I'll get to that in a sec. But one of the things that, as I was sort of thinking about, I was like, well, how could there always be a connection between metrics and logs, right? Because some metrics are just, hey, monotonically increase this one value, right? And it's just the name of the metric and increment is all that gets sent, right? Sure, you can have a bunch more on a metric. You have a big old string associated with it has tons of little key value pairs, but that's not implicit, right, in a metric, right? We need to be able to accept just like, hey, access log, one more access today, right? One more DB request, incremented by one. Well, that's not going to be connected to any point in time, any like anything that we could correlate back necessarily.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, so as to things being incomplete, I saw this great presentation, and I apologize to the speaker who gave it because I was trying to check who it was, and then I realized I was thinking about Hazel Weekly's presentation, which is also great, but it wasn't at Hazel's. But it was talking about how, in some ways, even the standard for OpenTelemetry is incomplete because the vision was that there was this kind of perfect braid where every single metric event, every single log, every single trace was always connected in this really implicit way. And neither the library, the project, or the standard is quite up to that point, right? Because there's not a standard for, hey, when you send a metric, always implicitly connected to a point in time or to an event or anything like that. So, yeah, we'll get there, but yeah, this gets us on to our next thing, which we sort of already answered, but can logs be enriched with additional context such as trace IDs or span IDs when using OpenTelemetry? I guess the answer to that one, you answer this.
Yeah, the answer for that is yes. So let's say with Java and this thing, Python, you can just use the SDK and then emit your trace ID and span ID. But let's say if you have something like a normal Go application or a JavaScript application, so there what you can do is you can just print your add your like trace ID and span ID to your log line. And what you can do is once those are ingested to OpenTelemetry, once the collector receives it, you can parse those trace ID and span ID from the message and then basically enrich the log. So it's present as a string, but you need to parse. So OpenTelemetry provides like a lot of operators and processors to parse those, and then you can basically enrich your log line.
And then you can also, right, you can get from the API, you can get like what is the current like trace and what is the current span that we're on, like what am I executing in. So if you wanted to, if you were adding like custom calls into your code and thinking about observability, right, you could absolutely decorate that way as well.
Right. So basically you can kind of add an appender, which will basically get the current trace ID and span ID and inject to your log.
And the fundamental separation there, right, is really what size is your team, right? Because if your team is very large, right, this expectation that you're going to go into your Node code or your Java code and add a bunch of calls to, add observability is like, that's a non-starter, right? There's 300 developers here. They're not going to do that, right? So then we're talking about collector config to process those logs and figure out and sort of post hoc connect. And I actually, from Hazel's presentation, now I do remember something really cool from Hazel's presentation. Hazel was talking about some limitations of what you can do with tracing at the collector level that I really want to dive more into. That's not for this show, but it was like, oh, you can't like post hoc connect spans in a trace. Like they have to be connected at creation time. And I was like, really? And I haven't like tested that out yet, but apparently this is like maybe like an API limitation currently. So this one I wrote, but it feels a little silly now to put it because I know we're like connecting with an external library, right? Like, what is the performance impact? But I guess, you know what? If you're excited about OpenTelemetry as an engineer, as a team lead, you're trying to get, management types on board, people who wear ties to work on board, right? They're going to ask you this. What is the performance impact of integrating logging with OpenTelemetry in a production system?
Right. So if you are using like Kubernetes or Docker, where applications are running and it's not using the SDK, it's directly printing the console, there will be little to no difference. Like it's the same. Just that there will be another component that is the agent that will be running on your Kubernetes cluster, which will collect those logs. By agent, I mean the OpenTelemetry collector. But let's say if you use the SDK for collecting the logs, it will be some amount of like resources that will be required in the background, which will basically collect those logs and batch and send them to a collector. So there will be minimal amount of resources required on that side. And then you can configure that as well, like what is the amount of batch size that you want to send. So basically you can do some tweaking, but it's not a significant one.
Yeah, this gets us to our next question, which is how do you configure? Now this is log sampling policies, which I think of as like batching, but I mean, I'll say I'm really curious. Like, are there production people who are like, hey, I only want to log? Well, yeah, because you might want to say, hey, if something matches this pattern, only send one of the logs that looks like that. Don't send all 20,000. So is that's possible to do with the collector config? Yeah.
So right now there is a processor named probabilistic sampling processor. So for traces, it's I think it's stable, but for logs right now it's in alpha.
Okay.
So with that, what you can do is you can configure some attributes for which you want to do on which you want to do sampling. So basically, it will check those attributes on each log line and perform sampling based on that attribute. So I think it should be ready in some time, but right now it's in alpha.
Yeah, this reminds me of way back in the day doing my first like sampling via regex. Is like, okay, very cool, but when we talk about like overhead, right, like an arbitrary regex can become very computationally expensive. So, right, the system to implement a processor based on that is going to be a complex piece of computer science work
Right.
to get that to work stably. So yeah, I mean, certainly, right, simple batching, yes, no problem, right? Like, don't send every single log line, wait 5 minutes, gather up all the logs, send them then. Capping at a data size, right? You can say, hey, for each batch, right, once you have more than X megabytes, right, go ahead and just start dropping logs. Because you had some crazy logging happen in this last round. That's all totally doable. But yeah, you're right that like probabilistic sampling and like, hey, if it matches X pattern so much, then that may not always.
Right.
Great question from a LinkedIn user. Currently, as a member of ELK team, we use FileBeat, FluentBit to ship the app logs to Logstash and Elasticsearch. How does this change with OpenTelemetry? Really great question. Thank you so much, LinkedIn user.
Right. So this is a good question. So basically, let's say you want to just explore OpenTelemetry. So in that case, what you can do is there is a Fluent for receiver on OpenTelemetry. You can enable that, and you can configure your FluentD or FluentBit to send logs to OpenTelemetry. So in that case, there will be very minimal change required, and you can see like uh, basically what's going on, and then you can see how it is seen on the OpenTelemetry side. But the other way is basically you want to remove FileBit and FluentBit from, I think FileBit is something that I okay. FluentBit is something that you can replace, but I think FileBit is something different. It's a I'm not really I can't totally recall it right now, but yeah.
Yeah.
FluentBit, you can replace FluentBit with OpenTelemetry. It will be the same, just that you have to configure it to script certain things like some files or Docker or Kubernetes. But yeah, it's completely same.
Yeah, and for this, I think a really solid way to answer questions like this, right, is to say like, hey, go look at the I'm sorry, I have the branch name in here, but OpenTelemetry collector -contrib, right, that repository which has all the receivers in it, and you can look at like, hey, is there a receiver for my framework? And for logging, right, it's going to be pretty straightforward that like a receiver exists, like no problem, it's going to translate that just fine. I know for traces from some formats, it's like, do I get quite exactly what I was expecting? It's going to depend on like how well that trace can be calced to like OTLP format. But if a receiver exists, you should have no problem using that. So the full answer to your question, LinkedIn user, is you're going to want to deploy the OpenTelemetry collector, and then you're going to want to use this receiver to grab those logs.
Right.
So, like, in terms of how do things change, I mean, there's going to be the overhead of running the collector. That should be mild, right? And you could do that just once per cluster or once per even cloud if you wanted to go large. So, yeah, that should be pretty straightforward.
Right.
Really good question from chat. Thank you so much. That's a good one. Okay, so one of these again, like sort of like management questions that maybe are they're a little bit off base, right? Like, how does OpenTelemetry handle log data retention and storage? And here we get to say the thing is like OpenTelemetry doesn't care how you store anything at all. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. So as you said, like OpenTelemetry doesn't care about how you store data and like store your logs data. So basically, what it has is exporters, and then exporters can be anything. Like you can build your own custom exporter. Let's say you want to write it in Postgres in certain schema. You can build the exporter of your own, and then you can configure Postgres to store like a certain amount of data. So OpenTelemetry doesn't handle it, but there are certain exporters through which you can specify where to store the data in what format.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing you can say there is, right, you can use processing to like cut down on the logs you're sending and their density, right, and including like you do have some logs behaviors that are very surprising that are like, hey, the entire page's HTML is coming through in this log, right? Like, so it's like, oh, let's you can obviously write a processor to say, hey, put this through this filter, right? Like that's totally doable to crush values out. And I actually wrote one little blog post about this, about using filters and processors to like crush out like PII and other like unexpected data from logs. So I guess I'll link that in the show notes. That was nice. Nice little plug I did not mean to have. So I had this one in here. What's the role of the collector? We've been talking about that, so I think we're good there. So what are storage considerations when working with logs? So now we're kind of moving a little bit away from OpenTelemetry core, but does the storage format matter for when you're querying later to do things like correlating by trace ID?
Yeah, so this is something very kind of difficult to solve thing, because sometimes you have to optimize for queries, sometimes you have to optimize for storage and cost, right?
Yeah.
So let's say if you are using some kind of hot storage like Elasticsearch or anything, so in that case what will happen is the cost of storing that hot data will be higher for query.
Yeah.
So it depends on your use case. Let's say you want to, you can use tired storage as well, but let's say you want to make your queries faster, like you want to use a trace ID and then find your log. So in that case, you'll have to index on trace ID. So you'll have to use storage solutions which supports indexing on certain fields. So in that case, you have to like basically organize your Explorer in such a way that basically you can query your data faster. But it totally depends on what you are trying to do. So if your case is like once in a while, okay, I will check my logs. It's not a deal breaker for me if the time to find those logs takes some time. In that case, you can just ignore any kind of indexing. You can just store in something like a file, or even, it doesn't matter. But let's say if you are someone who is like, okay, I need to find logs for this attribute or this index or this trace ID, then in that case, you have to consider some storage solution which provides some faster indexing and queries.
So I want to hop over to this question we got from chat, though there's a little more to say about this, but that's okay. So Craig sends in, it looks like not all languages have OTel logging implemented. If you go and look at the language support view, how solid stable are the APIs for logging in OTel compared to metrics and traces? So great question, Craig. This is one of those things where the teacher knows you were late to class, because this was the very first thing we talked about. If you saw that live notification and you said, "Shut up, family," threw down your cup of coffee, ran to the computer, you would have had an answer to this. But if you're joining us in a normal amount of time, we didn't cover this one first. I'll leave this question open, even though it covers most of our faces because it's a long one. So if you don't mind, I'll answer this one. Is that in general, you're going to be using, Craig, the collector to grab logs from an existing logging point and send them into your OpenTelemetry backend. It is true that in most languages, there is not support yet for making like an OpenTelemetry SDK call within your code to send a log. It is available for some of them, but it is not listed as stable. So that's a big distinction. I don't know, Nitya, let me know if I missed a detail there.
No, it's you're correct.
Okay. So yeah, that's kind of the distinction. Probably you're doing something for logging right now, right? So what you want to do instead is go ahead and use a component of the OpenTelemetry collector, a receiver, to grab those logs and send them on to your OpenTelemetry backend. But yeah, it is confusing because you think, oh, I can't do logs in OpenTelemetry at all. And you can, it's just going to be an adaptation of what you already have. And a huge one is, right, the file receiver, which can grab them from a file, grab them from console, and send them out.
Right. So if your application can write logs to a file or console, you can push them to OpenTelemetry.
Yeah. Fantastic. So those were the questions that I had. So you may, if you're checking them off at home, Nitya, then there were two others, and I'm like, no, we answered those already in our other questions. So we're good. So folks, that has been most of what I wanted to talk about. Did you have anything else you wanted to cover and make sure that people knew?
Yeah. So basically, we are even trying to do some building some API, or like, let's say, SDK for Golang. So we have built something for Golang, and we are trying to use it internally. So it's available on our GitHub page. But yeah, we need to do some more testing. Yeah.
Nice. Okay, I'll share that link in the show notes. So if you're watching this recorded down below, which I know like a couple hundred of you are every single week, which is
Yeah,
fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us for that. But yeah, go check the show notes, and I will link to that project. Obviously, the whole topic of like OpenTelemetry and Go is so fascinating. So I want to talk about that a little more on a future show. Speaking of future shows, we are trying to do these every single week, folks. Every single week, we're trying to talk about OpenTelemetry. So we will be back. We will have more shows. You can see a playlist of these on our YouTube playlist here. Thank you so much for checking them out. If you have follow-up questions, feel free to put in comments down in YouTube, or if you're watching this on LinkedIn, put them down there, and I will get back to you with those. I will get them to the team as well, and ask other people as well, so you don't have to just rely on my intelligence. And otherwise, yeah, subscribe and follow and do all that stuff. You know to do these things. If you saw this go live notification, if you're watching this, you got all that stuff set up already. Thank you so much for joining us. You can find me most places at Serverless Mom, but I think I'm switching. I think I'll be Otel Mom in a little while, because I'm moving on a little bit from serverless. My name is Nočnica Mellifera. Thank you so much to our guest, and we will be back soon. Thanks, everybody. All right. And